For two of the most important commanders of the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, the events of April 12, 1861 would change everything. Their lives before Fort Sumter would turn them into great generals. Their lives after will shape history itself.
The legend is that Grant was a drunken butcher.
Lee is indeed committing a treasonous act.
You could see the veins in his neck throbbing. You could see him punch his hand into his fist.
Grant never lost a battle. Lee did.
He was not a warrior in his soul.
Between 1862 and 1865, the most critical chapter of American history will be largely written by the actions of these two great generals and the millions of men who fought under them. Rarely does history find two commanders so different in personality, character, upbringing, and strategy as the ultimate commanders of the Northern and Southern armies.
Nobody in 1861 expected the American Civil War to escalate to the level that it did.
The actions of Lee and Grant will finally resolve whether this young nation continues as one country or two.
You could see Grant and Lee as representative of their respective worlds, their respective societies. Lee seems to stand for everything that is supposedly best about the South.
Most people concentrate on their differences. Grant was from a humble family. Lee was a member of the first family of Virginia.
Frankly, the Grant family's roots in this country went back absolutely as far as the Lees did. Grant was completely a gentleman, but he was not socially adept the way Lee was.
General Robert E. Lee had a much easier early life. He was in this house where we're sitting today as a youngster. I think he might be one of the most interesting, loved cruisers that the world has ever seen.
Who are the men behind the legendary names? How do Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant's lives and experiences on the battlefield compare? Who was the better general? One thing in common is that they both have difficult childhoods and difficult fathers. They are both smart and sensitive in their youth, and that they both grew up to become cold-blooded killers.
Robert E. Lee was the son of Harry Lighthorse Lee, the governor of Virginia, a great hero of the American Revolution. Went to West Point, he had that in common with Grant, but Grant came from almost nothing.
Lee, 16 years older than Grant, is born in 1806 into a genteel kind of poverty to Ann Carter and Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee. Two of his ancestors, Francis Lightfoot and Richard Henry Lee, were signers of the Declaration of Independence. Stratford, the ancestral home of the Lees, had been a wealthy tobacco plantation until Robert's father squandered the family fortune by speculating on land and other poor investments.
The Lee family had fallen on hard times. Lighthorse Harry, who was a great revolutionary hero, was also a great land speculator and not always so above board, and so abandoned the family when Robert was a small child, and the family was quite poor when he was growing up.
When Robert is 12, Lighthorse Harry dies of a fever returning from the West Indies, where he has been living as a fugitive. It is a devastating loss for Robert, who was devoted to his jovial, fascinating, brilliant father. Robert develops into a strong, athletic teenager with a penchant for mathematics and a reputation as a leader among his peers. When he turns 17, he needs to make a decision about what he will do in life. The Lee family still has influence, and with his wealthy relatives' assistance, Lee enters West Point in July 1825.
Lee arrived at West Point and the United States Military Academy eager to learn, eager to succeed. Really was perhaps the example of what a cadet should have been.
Lee finds West Point harsh, the accommodations Spartan, and the rules confining. But he thrives in this atmosphere, remaining at or near the top of his class during his entire 4 years, graduating as adjutant or head of the Corps of Cadets. The year is 1829, 32 years to the start of the Civil War. In 1830, Lee begins to court the wealthy Mary Ann Randolph Custis, who grew up at Arlington, the fabulous mansion overlooking the Potomac across from Washington, D.C.
Mary Custis was a lovely person, and she had lots of friends. She was very dynamic, and she was very well loved.
With the grudging consent of Mary's father, they are finally married on June 30th, 1831.
The myth was that Grant's first 39 years were spent doing nothing important, that he was a failure, and that he really didn't achieve anything.
Perhaps the most remarkable thing about Ulysses S. Grant was that he was so unremarkable. He is born to Jesse and Hannah Grant in the Ohio River town of Point Pleasant, about 30 miles from Cincinnati. The year is 1822.
Grant grew up hardscrabble in a very small Ohio town.
His mother was a very quiet woman, and Grant was quiet too. But Hannah was sensible, she was deeply religious, and she was basically a very good mother. His father was more bombastic.
His father is a tanner of animal hides.
One of these little details that I've always thought was funny is he could never eat rare meat. The sight of blood made him sick, so clearly he was not a warrior in his soul.
He is said to have been shy and indifferent to school, but is a born equestrian with an almost subliminal understanding of animals.
So before Ulysses knew anything about this, the father began exploring how his son could be nominated.
His father was a real American 19th century entrepreneur type, not always completely honorable, but successful. And that's how he managed to push his son into West Point against Ulysses' own wishes.
Grant enters West Point in 1839 at the age of 17, where he becomes an indifferent student, collecting over 250 demerits.
Demerits would be for a whole variety of things. Being late for the lineup in the morning, being late for meals, not showing proper deference. Grant was caught cooking in his room. That was a demerit too.
Grant had many more demerits than Lee. He was obviously never expelled from the academy or unaware of anything that was going to cause him to fail as a cadet.
He graduates from West Point in 1843 in the bottom half of his class. The Civil War is 18 years away. Like Lee, Grant also falls in love soon after graduation to Julia Dent, the sister of a West Point classmate. But their marriage too will have to be postponed. The nation is on the verge of war with Mexico, and Grant's regiment is ordered to the Mexican border. At the Battle of Monterey, Grant's regiment is caught up in savage house-to-house fighting and is running low on ammunition. Grant volunteers to ride to the rear and send a message forward. Few who were there would forget the sight of the young lieutenant clinging to the neck and side of his horse as he gallops through the gauntlet of Mexican fire down one street and up another.
They clung to the one side of the horse, and he switched over, so all they saw was a horse. They didn't see Grant.
It's almost a scene out of a Hollywood stunt movie, dodging bullets through an onslaught of attacks from Mexican soldiers, riding almost parallel to the ground at points.
In March of 1847, Robert E. Lee lands at Veracruz with General of the Army, Winfield Scott. Lee fights in every major battle on the march to capture Mexico City.
Lee, Grant, Sherman, Jackson, many of the leaders of the Civil War had proved themselves in the Mexican War.
Both Lee and Grant are among the first U.S. troops to enter Mexico City and meet briefly. When they again meet at Appomattox, nearly 20 years later, at the close of the Civil War, Grant remembers the occasion, but Lee cannot recall it. When the Mexican War ends in 1848, Grant returns to St. Louis and marries Julia Dent.
It's a great love affair. It lasts a long, long time. Grant is absolutely miserable when he's not with his wife. It's one of the reasons he occasionally would drink a little too much.
For the next 5 years, Grant struggles on a series of military outposts in the Midwest and the East Coast before finally being sent to the frontier of California. Out of Julia's company, he begins to drink heavily, which leads to his resignation from the Army on April 11, 1854.
There's no question that he was miserable without his wife, miserable without his 2 young children at that point. This is where the myth of his drinking gets born and promulgated by his enemies from then on.
He is 32 years old and so broke, he has to borrow money from his old West Point classmate, Simon Bolivar Buckner, in order to get home. It is exactly 7 years until the outbreak of Civil War.
This is a time in American culture, American life, when the temperance movement was going. The idea of drinking was suddenly going from being something that was smiled upon to be something that was deeply frowned upon in middle-class life.
The legend is that Grant was a drunken butcher who did not care about his men, a general who led his troops into battle in a drunken stupor.
When we talk about Grant's drinking, Julia is the important person. I believe that he does drink at Fort Vancouver and Fort Humboldt on the Pacific coast because he becomes so lonely and really shifts into what we today would call despair.
Grant returns to St. Louis with visions of becoming a gentleman farmer on 60 acres of land given as a wedding present by Julia's father. But everything seems to go wrong. Prices fall, profits vanish. Grant has to pawn his gold watch to buy Christmas presents.
He's reduced to the point where he's making less than $50 a month, which is pretty low in those days. He's scrounging to make a living to support himself and his family.
Around the same time, in 1852, after several years of random duties following the Mexican War, Jefferson Davis, the U.S. Secretary of War and future President of the Confederacy, appoints Lee Superintendent of West Point, a position he reluctantly accepts.
There's a wonderful image of his family leaving him one night at home, going to a military band concert, this great thing on the green at West Point, and they leave him lying on the sofa with an ice bag on his head because he's so stressed out from the job.
By then, Lee and Mary have 7 children. All 3 of the boys will serve with him in the Civil War, 2 of them as major generals. In 1855, Lee is promoted to second in command of the newly organized 2nd Cavalry Division, fighting Indians and protecting settlers in Texas. In late 1858, Grant goes into real estate work in Missouri, but dislikes collecting rents and hates the idea of evicting anyone.
Whatever he did seemed to not work. And he ultimately wound up as a clerk in his father's leather goods store when war found him.
With war barely 3 years away, open hostilities begin to plague the fragile Union. Abraham Lincoln is elected president on November 6, 1860. Panicked that slavery will be soon abolished under Lincoln, South Carolina becomes the first to secede from the Union on December 20th, 1860, along with 5 more southern states and Texas soon after. War is just months away. When Lee returns to Washington in early March 1861, he meets with the aging General Winfield Scott, head of the Union Army, with whom Lee fought in Mexico. Lee is soon offered senior command of the U.S. forces then being assembled to suppress the rebellion. But Lee declines the offer, saying, "If the Union is dissolved, I shall return to share the miseries of my people and draw my sword on none, save in defense of my native state."
In those days, states were more important than the national government. You were a Virginian, you were a Virginian. If you were from Massachusetts, you were from Massachusetts. You didn't have much going back and forth.
He found himself oddly stuck between his honor and his oath to his country and his honor and his oath to his state. From the perspective of anybody but the Confederacy, Lee is indeed committing a treasonous act. He is reneging on his oath.
Obviously, he wrestled with it for a long time. He hated the idea of disunion, but his loyalty lay with his state.
With that, after 35 years of service, Robert E. Lee writes his letter of resignation from the United States Army and returns to Arlington, just across the Potomac River.
On April 23rd, 1861, Lee came to Richmond from his home at Arlington. He was invited by the Virginia Convention that was meeting in this room. He met with Governor Letcher, who told him that they wanted to offer him the command of the Virginia forces, the Virginia Army and Navy, and he did accept that.
The thing about Grant is that he had a great sense of duty to the country, and that the Union above all needed to be honored. Without the Union, the American experiment would fall apart.
Grant feels honor-bound to offer his services to the Union. He notifies the War Department of his availability, but the letter was ignored. Then, by a stroke of fate, Grant finds himself back in uniform just as war is about to break out.
I think he just was bored and frustrated and saw the military as a way back into something that was meaningful to him.
Grant was assigned to Springfield, Illinois, and his new regiment of volunteers revealed themselves as little more than a mob of chicken thieves led by a drunkard. I took charge, divided them into squads, and superintended their drill. When they were ready to go to Springfield, I went with them and remained there until they were assigned to a regiment. Ulysses S. Grant, Personal Memoirs. Grant applies both the carrot and liberal doses of the stick to whip his malefactors into the 21st Regiment, Pride of Illinois.
He did so well that he got 2 more regiments to whip into shape, And the 3 regiments equaled a brigade, which required a brigadier general's rank, and so Grant then became a general.
After the start of the Civil War on April 12, 1861, and the shock of the First Bull Run, or Manassas, battles are fought along 2 fronts: the Eastern Front, from Virginia south, and the West, along the Mississippi River. The Federal Department of the West is in terrible shape, mainly owing to the vacillation and dithering of its commander, General John C. Fremont, the famed Western explorer of the 1840s. None of the Union generals, including Fremont, seem willing to take on the Confederates, who are actively campaigning in Missouri and Kentucky. Grant resolves to break the stalemate in the West. On November 7, 1861, he lands 3,000 men in 5 infantry regiments by river steamers just north of a large Confederate encampment at Belmont, Missouri.
Grant got with the naval commander and launched an amphibious operation down the Mississippi and landed just above Belmont and surprised the Confederates, drove them out of their camps.
It marks the first of his long and successful dealings with the Union Navy. It is his first bloody battle, as well as the first step along what is to become a treacherous road down the Mississippi River. The Battle of Belmont isn't much by later standards, but Grant's soldiers overrun the rebel encampment and rout its occupants before being forced to withdraw in the face of almost 3,000 Confederate reinforcements. Grant is left with almost 500 casualties.
Unfortunately, his well-meaning adventure turned into a fiasco in the press. He was lambasted for being foolhardy and so on, but his troops for the first time had gotten some combat experience, and that served them well in the near future.
February 3rd, 1862. The Civil War has been raging for 10 months. The Union Army has not won a major victory. Grant's army of 15,000 is traveling down the Tennessee River on transport ships and is steaming ashore toward Fort Henry. The task is to capture Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, along with as much territory in Tennessee as possible. If they succeed, the Union will control the critical Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, assuring that the Army will have safe, fast supply lines from the north. It is the largest amphibious landing of the war by the Union to date.
As they approached Fort Donelson, the Federal gunboats came under a terrific fire that blew up the smokestacks, crashed through their timbers, and killed any number of men and caused the gunboats to withdraw, so that Grant was forced to attack Fort Donelson with a siege, which wound up in a battle.
The ensuing fight is violent and deadly, and after several hours, it appears that the Union lines might break. But at the height of the battle, Grant rides into the melee and begins urging soldiers to pick up their cartridge boxes and fight. Seeing their commander at the front, they do it with a cheer, and the rebels are soon pressed back into their lines. In effect, this seals a Union victory, since there is now no escape.
The snow was stained with blood. Bodies were lying everywhere, and Grant appeared on the field with his staff and recoiled at the sight of this gore.
The scene harks Grant back to his childhood and the days of his father's tannery. "Let's get away from this dreadful place," he commented as he led his staff away. It is the first great victory for the Union Army since the war began. Grant becomes a hero in the North almost overnight. Grant has captured an entire rebel army, forcing an unconditional surrender from the rebels. And his plan has the added effect of collapsing the Confederacy's entire strategic plan from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. And they lose most of Tennessee as well. For Grant's part, it is heralded in the press that his initials, U.S., now stand for Unconditional Surrender Grant, an appellation that he carries proudly for the rest of the war.
Grant became famous not only for his unconditional surrender telegram, but also because he was depicted in the northern newspapers as smoking a cigar. And thousands of cigars were then sent to him from all over the North.
It was good press for Grant and showed the sort of initiative that's going on, but also showed some of Grant's tactical limitations. Grant preferred a poor plan which was violently executed when it came to a tactical situation.
Grant's victory leaves him poised with a golden opportunity to capture Nashville, the key to Middle Tennessee, and he is preparing to march his army out and take it. But he is ordered not to by his immediate superior, Major General Henry Halleck.
Grant became an enormous hero. He was the only one winning any fights. General Henry Halleck became jealous of Grant's victory because Halleck was sitting up in St. Louis behind a desk when Grant was out in the field winning victories and getting the headlines.
I think Lee certainly knew about Fort Donelson and Grant's success there and at Fort Henry and so on, because he liked to read the newspapers, he liked to keep up with what was going on. But he doesn't really tell us if he had an opinion about it.
This should have been a promising time for Grant, but instead, Halleck relegates Grant to the backwaters of Fort Donelson and orders the bulk of his command to board steamers and proceed south along the Tennessee River, wrecking bridges, railroads, and telegraph lines, and terrorizing the rebel population. Not only that, Halleck writes to George McClellan, then chief of the Union Army, charging Grant is neglectful, inefficient, and apparently has resumed his bad habits, a reference to Grant's insobriety that once caused him to leave the Army. McClellan responded, "Do not hesitate to arrest him at once if the good of the service demands it."
There was hardball in the Civil War. Reputations could be destroyed that way.
Such is Grant's naivete that in the midst of all this backstabbing, he writes to his wife, "There are not two men in the United States that I would prefer serving under than Halleck and McClellan." Finally, Lincoln himself intervenes. Since Grant won major battles for the Union, Lincoln tells Halleck to, quote, "put up or shut up." Understanding that veiled threat from Lincoln, Halleck quickly reinstates Grant to his command of the Army of the Tennessee. And his most costly and bloody battle is less than a month away. By April 1862, Ulysses S. Grant is back with the Army of the Tennessee. Over 40,000 strong, his forces camped at a steamboat wharf called Pittsburgh Landing, which will soon gain terrible immortality under a different name, Shiloh. The area is of vital importance to the Confederacy, as it is the crossroads of two of the South's most important railways. If Grant can take this area, the rebel campaign in the West will be terribly hobbled. One of Grant's divisions is now commanded by General William Tecumseh Sherman, an unlikely warrior who has struggled with deep melancholy in his past. Sherman will become Grant's best friend and confidant for the rest of the war.
General Sherman had been under a cloud ever since he had stated to the Secretary of War that it was going to take 250,000 soldiers to conquer the Mississippi River Valley. The Secretary of War said he was crazy, and that got into the press, so everybody thought Sherman was crazy. He rehabilitated himself, and essentially he was placed in charge of the battlefield at Shiloh.
20 miles south in Corinth, Mississippi, something very nasty is brewing. The rebel general Albert Sidney Johnston knows of the federal plan and assembles an army of 44,000 to attack and destroy Grant's men first. Grant knows the rebels are gathering men, but convinces himself it is to defend the railroad positions in Corinth, not to attack him. Turns out, he is dead wrong.
Grant was usually aggressive. That's what got him his victory at Fort Donelson. But at Shiloh, he kept his men in camps.
The Battle of Shiloh opened very abruptly. On April 6, 1862, General Sherman's division was sitting down to their breakfast. There were sporadic sounds of firing, and Sherman rode out with his staff to see what was the matter. And as soon as he got into the field, his orderly was shot dead right next to him. And he realized that they were under attack by a whole Confederate army. Nobody knew. They were totally surprised.
Some of Sherman's men simply run across the hills and fields toward the river. Others try to stand up against the onslaught, but finally cave in and flee too. By 10 a.m., the rebel artillery is working its way to Sherman's rear, and he is forced to withdraw. It is the same with Grant's other divisions. The attack is so sudden that many rebel soldiers stopped to finish off the still warm breakfasts of their Yankee counterparts. Sherman finally rallies what is left of his command around a little wood-planked Methodist chapel where he made his headquarters. It is named Shiloh, a Hebrew word meaning place of peace.
The evening of the first day of the Battle of Shiloh was very disheartening for the Union. They had been pushed back everywhere with their backs to the river.
By sundown, everyone is exhausted, used up by the constant exertion and horror of a full day's battle.
Grant had sought refuge in what he thought was going to be his headquarters there, but it had been occupied by the surgeons. And as we went in, of course, we know his revulsion at blood and gore. Well, they were with their bloody knives and bone saws. And he recoiled at this and went out and he sat under a tree. General Sherman came up to him and said, "Well, General Grant, we've had the devil today, haven't we?" And Grant said, "Yes, Sherman, we have. Whip him tomorrow, though."
Grant is good to his word. The fighting begins again at daybreak, but this time it is Grant who is driving the rebels with superior force. At this point in the battle, it was said you could walk across the open parts of the battlefield, stepping on nothing but corpses. By midday, Beauregard is faced with a new problem. Don Carlos Buell's Union Army, 20,000 strong, marching down from Kentucky, is reinforcing Grant. There is no choice. The rebels must withdraw back to Corinth. With this, the Battle of Shiloh ends. Grant wins an extremely costly and bloody victory for the Union. About 23,000 men have been killed, wounded, or captured in about equal numbers on both sides.
The butcher's bill for this war would be tremendous. The northern people, and I think the southern people, paused and were in shock at the sacrifice.
Nothing like Shiloh had ever happened in the Western Hemisphere. People were horrified. More soldiers were killed at the Battle of Shiloh than during the Revolutionary War, and the War of 1812, and the Mexican War combined.
After Shiloh, Grant began to see that a single battle would not win the war, that it was going to be more or less a war of endurance.
In the North, the press blames Grant for not fortifying, for letting his men be surprised, and for the massive death toll. And of course, there are the usual charges of drunkenness, incompetence, and sloth.
Grant was denounced from the halls of Congress to the White House as being an incompetent, and many calls were made for his removal. Instead, Lincoln was reported to have said, "Find out what kind of whiskey that man drinks and send all my generals a barrel of it. I can't spare that man, he fights."
Lee was beloved with his soldiers. The bond between Lee and his soldiers was unshakable. No army loved Grant like that.
March 1862. Just as Grant lands at Shiloh, in the east, Union General George B. McClellan invades Virginia with a massive army of 112,000. The strategy is to march on the rebels' capital of Richmond and end the war. The Army of Northern Virginia, commanded by General Joseph E. Johnston, begins giving battle to the superior federal force at every strong point up the peninsula to the eastern edge of Richmond. But then, fate intervenes. At the Battle of Seven Pines, sometimes known as Fair Oaks, Johnston is badly wounded. Replacing him as commander of the Army of Northern Virginia is General Robert E. Lee. It is June 1st, 1862. The war is well into its second year.
A lot of people were critical of the selection of Lee as a commander of the Confederate forces because it was suggested he was not aggressive enough. He'd been called the king of spades by some of his men for requiring them to excavate elaborate defenses around Richmond.
I'll tell you one of the interesting things about this early entrenchment here in Richmond is that it's one of the things that inspires Lincoln to agree to the early steps of the Emancipation Proclamation, because he sees that this work is largely being done by slaves. Lincoln, in a very pragmatic way, is seeing exactly what that labor is being used for, which is to shore up the Confederate Army.
At the end of June, the 56-year-old Lee lashes out with a series of astonishingly violent attacks on the Federal Army, sending them reeling across the front of the city towards the James River in what becomes known as the 7 Days Battles. Lee now commands 92,000 men, the largest Confederate army ever assembled during the war. McClellan's plan to capture Richmond is ruined, and his army retreats back down to Fortress Monroe to re-embark on its transports for Washington.
The 7 Days battles were fought half the time in swamps and in terrible conditions, very much like Shiloh, and the results were the same, the horrendous casualties.
Lee's attacks are brutal and deadly for both sides. McClellan recognizes quickly that Lee uses this army more aggressively than Johnston ever did.
In certain ways, these battles are catastrophic, but he also learns a very important lesson, which is the power of intimidation.
He had turned the war around in the Eastern Theater in a dazzling manner that made his army and himself the center of attention.
Lee's army sustains 20,000 casualties just from the time that he took command, 30 days earlier. Whatever his other shortcomings, no one now could accuse Lee of not being aggressive, a fact that remains true till the final days of the war. The enduring legend of Robert E. Lee as a gambler is born at the Battle of Second Manassas in the late summer of 1862. Betting that McClellan will give him no further trouble after the slaughter of the 7 days' battles, Lee sets out to lay a trap for a division of McClellan's Union Army being assembled under Major General John C. Pope in Northern Virginia. If Lee can intercept Pope's force before reinforcements from McClellan's nearby army reaches it, a great victory might be won.
Lee ordered his brilliant cavalry commander, General Jeb Stuart, to snoop around and find out what General Pope's location and size and intentions were. And Stuart actually did him one better. He sneaked into General Pope's headquarters tent and stole his secret papers as well as his dress uniform.
On August 25th, Lee makes a risky decision in violation of all strategic military principles. He divides his army instead of concentrating it in the face of a superior enemy force, in this case, Pope's 60,000 plus men. Lee sends Stonewall Jackson with a force of 20,000 to the northwest to get behind Pope's army. At the same time, Lee and Major General Longstreet and their 30,000 men hide to the west of Pope's army. Ready for battle, Jackson, under Lee's orders, is set up along a railroad cut, a long trench-like road that gives his troops good cover, just 25 miles from Washington. Lee dares Pope to attack his army. This Pope does the next day, hurling ranks of bluecoats against the outnumbered Confederate position in the mistaken impression that he has Stonewall Jackson cornered. By nightfall, the rebels still hold their 2-mile-long front in the trenches along the railroad tracks, with Jackson himself, according to one of his men, calm as a May morning. Meanwhile, part of McClellan's army is landing on the Virginia side of the Potomac, about 40 miles to the east of Pope and marching toward the fight. Soon the Federals will have overwhelming power on the field. But Pope does not know that the rebel General Longstreet's 30,000 men are hidden in the woods along the left flank of the Yankee army. But just when it seems that Stonewall Jackson's line will surely break, Lee springs his trap. Longstreet suddenly emerges from the woods and begins tearing apart thousands of shocked bluecoats caught out in the open. Then his force descends upon the exposed flank of the hapless Yankee army. It is the largest mass assault of the war and completely routs Pope's army, which he withdraws in humiliation back to Washington.
The success of the 7 days battles, and particularly Second Manassas, was arguably his greatest battle.
He was so successful in those early Civil War battles, even though he was losing large numbers of men, he was executing brilliant battlefield maneuvers and victories that won tremendous admiration.
Well, Second Manassas made Lee almost godlike in the South. He had whipped General Pope so thoroughly that he sent him flying back to Washington. It was one of the most decisive victories of the war, and of course led on to Antietam.
Meanwhile, Ulysses Grant is languishing in a kind of military limbo. despite his fame and victories, Halleck has been treating him like an unwanted relation. Grant is thinking of quitting the Army.
Sherman got wind of this, his friend, and went to see him, and he began to plead with him that he would be miserable sitting on the sidelines and watching other generals fight the war. He said to Grant, some happy accident will restore your proper place in the Army. And so Grant stayed in the Army, and indeed, within a few weeks, a happy accident occurred.
On July 11, 1862, Abraham Lincoln selects Henry Halleck to be General-in-Chief of the Union Army and is assigned to Washington. With Halleck gone from the West, Grant is again placed in charge of the Army of the Tennessee.
Grant was a person who was willing to let the advancement come if it was deserved by his actions.
By the close of 1862, the major task facing Grant is the capture of the rebel stronghold at Vicksburg, Mississippi. If he can capture it, the Confederacy will literally break in two and give the Union total control of the Mississippi River. An enormous, if not fatal, blow to the Confederacy.
Lincoln had said that Vicksburg was the key to the whole Western campaign, and Grant felt like he was the man with the men to do the unlocking.
This, however, will prove a taller order than Grant ever imagined. After the dramatic victory at the Battle of Second Manassas, Lee's reputation as the greatest general of the war is born. Brimming with success, Jefferson Davis and his cabinet approves a plan to invade the North.
He thought that by invading the North, that would draw the Union Army out of its fortifications in Washington.
Ultimately, for Robert E. Lee to convince Jefferson Davis to go on an offensive into Union territory was a radical departure from Confederate strategy.
It is concluded in high Confederate circles that a victory on northern soil might prompt England and France to recognize the Confederacy and thus lift the Union blockade of southern ports. Lee's plan is to march 40,000 men from Virginia into the Union territory of Maryland beginning September 4th, 1863.
He had gone north with the idea that Maryland might join the South. It was a slave state, and that they might liberate Maryland, and that they would be warmly welcomed.
Lee again rolls the dice. In the face of McClellan's overwhelming force of 75,000, Lee divides his smaller army. On September 10th, Lee sends Stonewall Jackson with a force of 19,000 to capture the Union arsenal and garrison at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which he does not want to leave in his rear. And Longstreet, with a force of 19,000, heads towards Hagerstown, Maryland, along with Lee. Rebel cavalry scouts report that McClellan's army is approaching from the other side of the Blue Ridge Mountains, fast. To make matters even worse for Lee, sometime during the march, one of his messengers makes one of the biggest blunders of the war.
It was a terrible blow for Lee to find out that McClellan had come into possession of his secret orders, which had been found by a Union sergeant wrapped around a bundle of 3 cigars. These were taken to General McClellan. It was verified it was General Lee's signature. And these orders revealed the entire Confederate battle plan.
This puts the Confederate Army at a sudden disadvantage. Lee immediately orders all of his scattered forces together. But Jackson and A.P. Hill's forces at Harper's Ferry will not arrive for almost a day. This will prove very problematic for the battle to come. The two armies finally meet near a small Maryland town called Sharpsburg. Lee has his back to the Potomac River, and his army is arrayed for 4 miles north to south along a narrow stream named Antietam Creek. General McClellan's 75,000 men stand on the east side of Antietam Creek while he organizes them for battle. Lee has only 20,000 men. Hill and Jackson are slowly making their way from Harper's Ferry. If McClellan attacks now, it could mean the end of Lee's force. But as luck and fate would have it, McClellan waits. At dawn on September 17th, McClellan attacks. The Battle of Antietam begins. Lee is outnumbered by the Yankees, but he is able to move reinforcements from other parts of the field. The sun has not risen halfway into the sky when McClellan's initial attack sputters out, but at the terrible cost of 13,000 casualties for both sides. McClellan launches the second phase of his assault, this time on the middle of Lee's line. By afternoon, the weight of McClellan's superior force begins to tell, and the rebels are giving way. The Union smelled victory. But just then, one of those seeming battlefield miracles occurs with the arrival on the field of General A.P. Hill's rebel division of 2,700 men, which has practically jogged 17 miles from Harper's Ferry to reach the scene of the action. By the end of battle at 5:30 p.m., Hill's vigorous and savage attack pushes the Yankees to the west bank of Antietam, but he has not defeated them. The battle is baffling for many of the Union soldiers, as many of the Confederates were wearing Union uniforms Hill took from Harper's Ferry. On the morning of the 18th, Lee awaits an attack, but it never comes. He leaves for Virginia with his troops that evening. With that, Antietam ends, essentially in a draw. 23,000 men have fallen.
It is the single bloodiest day in the history of American combat.
He kept thinking, well, if I just make a flashy entrance into Maryland at Antietam and win a victory, or if I show them that I can get to Gettysburg, they'll all give up. But the North wasn't going to give up.
Lincoln took advantage of the fact that the advantage had gone to the Union at Antietam to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which had really grave political consequences.
As Lee is being turned back at Antietam, Grant is planning the most important offensive of his career so far. Vicksburg is considered by virtually everyone, north and south, to be an impregnable fortress. Newspapers call it the Gibraltar of the West.
Ulysses S. Grant and Abraham Lincoln agreed that in order to exercise full control of the Mississippi River, Vicksburg would have to fall.
Vicksburg was a terribly hard nut to crack. The Union Navy under General Farragut had tried 3 times to approach it from the south with its big warships, and they were repelled each time. It was going to have to be a land operation. And so General Grant was called in.
In the winter of 1862, Grant begins marching his army straight down the middle of the state of Mississippi to capture the prized city. What Grant doesn't count on is the ingenuity of the rebel general Earl C. Van Dorn, who sees a weakness in Grant's plan. On December 20th, Van Dorn's cavalry completely surprises the federal garrison at Holly Springs. This is Grant's main supply dump for his 35,000 men. With only a few shots, Van Dorn quickly hobbles Grant's army. The raiders take as much as they can carry and burn the rest, $100 million worth today, before taking off north for Tennessee, tearing up rail track and telegraph wires behind them. On the morning of December 21st, Grant has no choice but to retreat back to Memphis in humiliation, lest his army starve.
The Union Army were saying that all of his plans to take Vicksburg were failing, that Grant was a failure, and Lincoln was worried about him. He really was.
Thus, 1862 closes with almost no good news for General Grant. In December 1862, Lincoln's new commander of the Army of the Potomac, General Ambrose Burnside, promptly marches his 120,000-man force south from Warrenton, Virginia, toward Fredericksburg, where he hopes to traverse the Rappahannock River and engage Robert E. Lee. But Lee has gotten there first, with 78,000 rebels. Lee's position is very strong, high on a hill named Marye's Heights, which is crowned by a stone wall. On December 12, 1862, Burnside's men cross the bridges and enter the town, which they loot and burn. At the center of the line, thousands of Yankees try to climb the heights, and that's when Lee's artillery opens up, as well as the rebels behind the stone wall.
A great deal of the Fredericksburg battlefield was uphill. It was like shooting fish in a barrel.
It is a horrific slaughter. Lee's Confederate guns literally sweep the Federal ranks away in long rows, coating the hillside with blue-clad bodies. Charge comes after charge. Men are mowed down by the thousands.
Lee is said to have stood watching that slaughter and to have remarked to Longstreet at his side, "It is good that war is so terrible, else we would grow too fond of it."
By the time of the Union withdrawal on December 15th, there are 18,000 casualties, 2/3 on the Union side.
The Battle of Fredericksburg clearly shows, if nothing else, that the Confederacy is far from a defeated force. It's hard to describe what exactly it was that the Union Army was attempting to accomplish.
At the end of that battle, yes, they had won, but they had not really gained anything either tactically or strategically, which Lee is aware of.
My guess is that he came away thinking that Burnside was one of the stupidest opponents he'd ever fought against. If anything, the Battle of Fredericksburg emboldened General Lee.
Unlike Grant, in limbo way out in the West, 1862 closes on a very good note for General Lee. At the end of 1862, while Lee is destroying Yankees in Virginia, Grant and his army remain stuck on the wrong side of the Mississippi River, trying to figure out how to get at Vicksburg across the way. Grant attempts an implausible sneak around known as the Yazoo Pass Expedition.
He went about 350 miles north of Vicksburg and blew a levee in the river. The problem was when he blew the levee, it flooded the countryside but 300 or 400 miles around. Grant was convinced by the Union naval commander, Admiral Porter, that because of the great flood caused by the Moon River breaking the levee, he could actually bring his warship very close to Vicksburg.
Finally, he sends Sherman and Porter into what might be the wildest expedition of the Civil War. It's an audacious plan by Grant, one that literally has him sending gunboats across what was dry land just days prior. Sherman sets out on March 16, 1863, with ironclads and troop transport ships into Steele's Bayou, now 15 feet deep. Previous to the flood, it did not contain enough water to float a canoe.
As these ironclads were steaming through the bayous, possums and raccoons and other wildlife would fall from the trees onto the decks.
Sometimes bears, they said, would fall on the decks. Crews of these transport ships would go out and try to sweep them away.
Confederate sharpshooters hiding in the woods would try to pick them off. It was an experience unlike any sailor ever anticipated when he joined the Navy.
But it was only the first of several of General Grant's schemes to cross that river.
The press, as usual, is watching and waiting with shrill cries and mean whispers. And Grant's enemies are again calling for his dismissal.
The failure of these efforts brought much criticism down on Grant's head until he finally ran his gunboats and transports directly by the guns of Vicksburg in April, got his troops below, crossed the river, got on dry land, and undertook his brilliant Vicksburg campaign.
While Grant's wretched run of luck continues at Vicksburg, Robert E. Lee is about to attain what might become his supreme moment as a commander. By the spring of 1863, there has been another change of Union commanders in the East. Lincoln has replaced Burnside with General Joseph Hooker, who with an army of 120,000 hopes to take Richmond and end the war. It is by now a familiar scenario in a war that gets bloodier by the day. And as always, General Robert E. Lee has a different plan. Lee leaves a small force at Fredericksburg and marches to meet the Union Army at the edge of a dense and forbidding forest called the Wilderness. Hooker, inexplicably, has halted the Union advance. Soon, Lee's army finds him. After a short battle, Hooker pulls back and concentrates his men at Chancellorsville, Virginia. The next move is Lee's.
What he did next at Chancellorsville was remarkable. He again divided his army in order to again surprise and defeat the Union commander. It was really one of the most brilliant tactical moves performed by either army during the war.
Scouts report that Hooker's right flank is up in the air, meaning that it is unprotected. Stonewall Jackson marches his 28,000 men right across the face of Hooker's front line and attacks his exposed position. It is a maneuver of great daring. That night, May 2nd, however, while making a reconnaissance of the enemy lines, Stonewall Jackson is mistakenly shot and fatally wounded by his own troops. A loss Lee would never get over.
Lee never wins an offensive victory after Stonewall Jackson's death. He wins some defensive ones, but he never wins an offensive campaign after that.
Next day, Lee attacks full force, which breaks the Federal line. Hooker retreats back across the Rappahannock in utter defeat. Over 24,000 men fall. 14,000 Federals and 10,000 Confederates. 20% of Lee's army.
Chancellorsville is another battle in which Lee at the end says it was an empty victory. He said, we gained not 1 inch of ground, we gained nothing. And the loss is horrendous.
But now, Lee is faced with a terrible dilemma. What to do next?
And there is a debate at some point between Lee and Davis for Lee to send forces in operational support of an ongoing siege in Vicksburg in 1863 being conducted by Grant. And Lee ultimately makes the decision not to go to Vicksburg.
That was their worst fear at that point, was that Lee would be sent to Vicksburg. And one of the strategies of the Army of the Potomac, if you read the letters from Meade's headquarters, was to keep Lee in the east.
In April 1863, while Lee is entrenched at Chancellorsville, Grant finally persuades the Navy to run the rebel batteries at Vicksburg, at last allowing him a river crossing below the enemy guns. Before the stunned Confederates can react, Grant's army is ashore in Mississippi. It is one of the few major calculated risks Grant has been willing to take, but it is a brilliant success. At last, on May 16, 1863, Grant turns on Vicksburg, where John C. Pemberton's 23,000-man rebel army meets him at a place called Champion Hill. Grant engages Pemberton and wins quickly. The rebels flee into the city of Vicksburg. So rather than suffering further attacks and causing civilian casualties, Grant settles in for a siege.
The main thing is to cut the besieged base off from food, water, anything that they can use, and to make it as uncomfortable as possible. And of course, Grant did that.
But the siege of Vicksburg is no pushover. And as the weeks pass by, Grant knows that the Confederate government is gathering an army of relief and will soon be on the attack again.
Robert E. Lee was not a well man at Gettysburg. Some historians say he might have had a minor heart attack, and it's been the judgment that it affected his thinking of how to get the battle on a winning side.
In early June, Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia, now 71,000 strong, begin crossing the Blue Ridge Mountains northward into the Shenandoah Valley. And by June 15th, the lead elements have crossed the Potomac River into Maryland. Once again, Lee and Davis attempt to invade the North.
And he goes north with the same kind of objectives, thinking that this is somehow going to so demoralize the Union that it will end the war effort. And what he finds on the Gettysburg campaign is, again, that the Union Army, it rallies them.
In choosing to go to Gettysburg, whether Vicksburg would have achieved something else or not, it does show a certain limitation in Lee's vision for the war.
Thoroughly alarmed, Lincoln removes the ineffective Joseph Hooker and appoints General George Gordon Meade to lead the Army of the Potomac. He is Lincoln's fourth commander in 8 months. Meade takes over command as the Union Army marches parallel to Robert E. Lee's forces on the opposite sides of the mountains, across the river, through Maryland, and finally to the little town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Lee's forces first collide with the Yankee cavalry on July 1st, 1863. Lee did not wish to bring on a major battle at this point. But the Battle of Gettysburg has begun. The fighting rages, with the rebels in command for most of the day. Even though Lee's forces do not capture the hills of the city, a fatal miscalculation. The tide is with the Confederacy on day one.
The Union Army is prescient enough to take command of the heights on the outskirts of the town that have the most commanding position. So they're in the best situation they could possibly be for having been beaten that first day.
By nighttime, much of the remaining infantry of both armies arrives on the field. Over 150,000 men on both sides. The horror is just beginning for Robert E. Lee.
Lee, on the first day, could have occupied Little Round Top, or even at the beginning of the second day. It's only later in the day that suddenly he scrambles around and understands that this has got such a prominent position on the battlefield.
July 2nd, 1863, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the second day of battle. Lee is up before daylight. He meets with his generals and expects to watch the attacks he ordered. But to his dismay, the entire field remains quiet. As the sun rises along Cemetery Ridge, it shines on blue uniforms freshly arriving to occupy its heights. But his own commanders today will bedevil Lee almost as much as the Yankees. At noon, there is still no attack by Longstreet, and even more Yankee units are pouring onto Cemetery Ridge. It's not until about 4 p.m. that Longstreet's 15,000 men will be ready to charge.
I think Lee should have communicated more specifically to these men exactly what he wanted, and he should have gone and seen to it. Nobody will ever know what went on with Longstreet.
About the same time, General Hood's division starts up the Emmetsburg Road, but half are forced to veer right to dispose of fierce enemy fire from a notorious boulder-strewn hellhole called the Devil's Den. Some of the most terrible fighting of the Civil War is seen during the next hour or two, much of it hand-to-hand. In spite of Longstreet's delay, the rebel attack seems to be succeeding. But then, the gods of war seem to fail Lee entirely, as A.P. Hill fails to coordinate his troops and sweep the field for Lee. And the Yankees take more of the battlefield. This lack of coordination is the bitterest pill for Lee. Thousands lie dead, and the Federal Army still occupies the ridge as night closes in. While the pitiful pleas and moans of the wounded rise into a sky alive with cold, hard stars.
There's actually a European observer who's attached to them at this time and is really taking notes on how Lee is manning this operation. And he faults him also. He said every one of his subordinates is against these plans, and Lee is overriding them.
They have hit the Union right the first day, and the Union left the second. Tomorrow, Lee will try to hit the Union center with the fresh division of General George Pickett's Virginians. It will be a charge for the ages. Ironically, Grant's greatest victory and Lee's greatest defeat will come within hours of each other on the 87th anniversary of the birth of the United States, July 4th, 1863. Grant's siege of Vicksburg lasts from May to July of 1863, during which time the town and its citizens suffer terribly between the Union bombardment and slow starvation. From the Mississippi River on the west side of town, about a dozen U.S. Navy mortar ships conduct a 24-hour barrage from huge 13-inch guns that lob missiles as big as full-grown hogs, which wreck buildings and blow holes in the ground 10 feet deep and 16 feet across. And from the east, Grant's big siege guns keep up a steady fire that kill people and destroy many of the antebellum homes.
Grant in Vicksburg is ultimately realizing and proving his vision for a hard war, utilizing every single possible resource Grant could possibly get his hands on to break both the physical and actual will and combat power of the forces he faces.
By this time, Vicksburg had been under siege in one way or the other for nearly a year, and the people had taken to digging caves. Some people lived 100 people in these caves. They'd furnish them with old Persian rugs and tables and chairs and lamps, outfit them with kitchens.
By June, it is apparent that the end is near for the rebel army. Food has become so scarce that the soldiers are forced to eat their mules, then their horses. 27-year-old Mary Loughborough lives in a cave with her 2-year-old daughter, while her husband, a major in the Confederate Army, fights in the lines. Food has nearly given out.
At one point, one of the Confederate soldiers stopped by the cave, brought him a jaybird to play with, and the little girl played with it, for a minute or two, and then she lost interest. The servant, the slave of this woman, who took care of the child, said, "Miss Laurinburg, she's hungry. Why don't you let me take the little bird and make her some soup?"
Mary Loughborough is horrified. She says, "At first I refused. The poor little plaything should not die. Then, as I thought of the child, I half consented."
Very soon there appeared a little bowl of soup on a plate with a little bit of white meat for the child. Now that's how bad it had become.
As June draws to a close, the situation is desperate. Confederate General John Pemberton receives an anonymous letter purporting to be from the men in ranks, titled, "An Appeal for Help." "Men don't want to starve, but if you can't feed us, you had better surrender us, horrible as the idea is." Pemberton has little choice. It is clear no Confederate army is going to relieve them.
There's no reason to have your men starve to death. Fighting is one thing, starvation is something else. And so he went out to see General Grant.
On July 3rd, about the same time that Lee is undergoing his ordeal at Gettysburg, Pemberton goes out to meet Grant between the lines in the shade of an oak tree. There is some parley and disagreement over terms, but after Pemberton returns to his side, he sends Grant a note saying he will capitulate the rebel army. It arrives well past midnight, but Grant has remained awake in his tent and at his desk. Grant's son, Freddie, age 13, is laying on a cot when his father opens the envelope. He gave a sigh of relief. Vicksburg has surrendered. There was no shouting, no histrionics. It was pure Grant.
He was known as Unconditional Surrender Grant. But in Pemberton's case, he decided not to imprison the Confederate Army because he didn't have enough transports to carry the whole army north. So he let them march out of Vicksburg under parole.
The following morning, July 4th, 1863, the rebel flags are struck all along the lines around Vicksburg, and Grant's victorious army marches into the city. But when they see the hungry, starved condition of the rebel soldiers, many of the bluecoats break ranks and begin offering hardtack and beef jerky from their haversacks. Soon the formation becomes intermingled. Tails are swapped, hands are shaken. It is over. Grant has won what might have been the greatest victory in the Western theater of operations. July 3rd, 1863. Grant is just hours away from his victory at Vicksburg. 1,000 miles to the east, in the hills of southern Pennsylvania, Robert E. Lee is about to put his Army of Northern Virginia to its supreme test. All hell is about to break loose on day 3 at Gettysburg. That morning, 120 rebel guns have been run out in a mile-long line facing the ridge. At 1 p.m., Lee opens the greatest artillery barrage ever heard in the Western Hemisphere, before or since.
Lee had sent Pickett and a huge Confederate force numbering somewhere between 14 and 18,000 dead straight on into the Union lines, and they were repulsed with great loss of life. Men would fly violently off of their feet as if snatched by invisible ropes.
But the column moves on, leaving the bloody dead and mangled in its wake. Lee cannot see any of this because of the heavy gun smoke that hangs over the field. But he may have faintly caught the noise of the rebel yell, which, according to one observer, floated out of the boiling, flame-stabbed cauldron like a vast, mournful roar. But soon, Lee beholds a sight that must have caused a shiver of dismay to rise up his spine. Hundreds of men are emerging from the murky, flashing, shell-torn crest of Cemetery Ridge and walking back toward the rebel lines. They are Confederate soldiers. The charge has failed. The battle is lost.
After something like Pickett's charge was over, which resulted in about 6,000 casualties to the attacking Confederates, you would see hundreds and hundreds of men lying on a few acres of ground, dead. You would also see some walking wounded going to the rear. So it would be the most dismal sight imaginable.
Now Lee shows all of the supreme self-mastery for which he is rightly famous. He mounts his horse Traveler and rides down to meet them, some crying, others cursing, and still others in a hellish shock. All this has been my fault, he tells them. The 3 days fighting has produced a total of 51,000 casualties, split nearly evenly between the Confederates and the Federals, of which over 8,000 lie dead and decomposing in the July heat.
At the end of the Battle of Gettysburg, Lee's army is overextended. It is out of supplies. It is out of munitions. It is unable to resupply itself, and it is forced into retreat.
That was the high tide of the Confederacy, and once Lee had lost that battle, he never regained the offensive again.
These events occurred on the 4th of July, 1863, which in a saner world would have been an excellent time to stop the war.
These victories in Vicksburg and Gettysburg are going to go a long way towards convincing people that this is a war that can be won.
Grant wrote in his memoirs that the fate of the Confederacy was sealed on July 4th, 1863. He believed Vicksburg was the battle, even more than Gettysburg, that secured eventual victory for the United States.
But it was not a saner world, and the furies raged both north and south, and the war continued for 2 more horrid years.
More people died in that period of time than had died previously.
It was inevitable, of course, that Grant and Lee would face each other in battle. They would clash all across Lee's beloved Virginia for well over a year.
After Vicksburg, Lincoln selected Grant to be the next commander of the Union forces, and Grant went east to meet Lee.
Lee, the gambler, and Grant, the odds player, would find themselves caught up in a ferocious death struggle in early 1865 that would determine the fate of the nation.
When Grant and Lee met, Lee had no room to maneuver. Grant's army was so large that he could simply flank him everywhere he tried to go. And Lee knew that the game was up.
I don't think he was ambitious, but I think when he found himself suddenly famous and a general and being noticed, that he probably began to enjoy it. He'd been a failure at so much and obscure for so long that I think success and victory must have turned his head a little bit.
When he and Grant met at Appomattox on that fateful day, Grant had a tremendous feeling for him, admiration, as did Lee for Grant. And Grant never gave an idea of doing anything that would hurt the Army of Northern Virginia, which he could have ravaged.
Lee and Grant meet for the last time as enemies at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, where they ratified the end of hostilities on April 9th, 1865. This meeting neither man will ever forget.
Grant, I think, certainly sensed Lee was a dignified man, as Grant was, and he tried to make small talk. Lee wasn't much interested in that. I think he was dramatically upset by the turn of events.
One of the accounts talks about this person of tremendous poise and dignity and presence, the enormous presence that Lee had, but that as he walked out of the room, you could see the veins in his neck throbbing. You could see him punch his hand into his fist. You could see the flush of his face, and what a powerfully terrible moment this must have been for him.
Passions on both sides of the Civil War have hardly ceased since the last shots were fired in the spring of 1865. Despite the final outcome, the debate continues. Which general best served his cause?
Ultimately, the question becomes, who was the better general? If it was going to come down to tactics, and I needed someone to actually win a battle, to actually do something inventive, to think really creatively with the application of troops, the application of combat resources, then perhaps the guy I would pick would be Robert E. Lee. But if I was going to pick a man to understand how to make all the pieces fit together and how to get it all to work, you're going to really have to give the edge to Grant.
Grant never lost a battle. Lee did. I think that Robert E. Lee would have been delighted to have Grant's army. He would have used the army quite differently. I think that Grant would have been very unhappy to have had Lee's army.
What U.S. Grant did for this country is never going to be undone, and it's never going to be surpassed. He really literally saved this country from falling apart.
Lee, of course, is the American commander who had the highest percentage of losses of any commander. His strategies were very expensive ones in terms of human life.
The number of men killed during the Civil War was 620,000 at least. That's a minimum. That was 2% of the American population of 1860. In the United States of today, if the same percentage of soldiers died in a war, the number of American war dead would be more than 6 million.
Robert E. Lee went on to become president of Virginia's Washington College, now Washington and Lee University. He died in 1870. Ulysses S. Grant became the 18th President of the United States, serving from 1869 to 1877. He died in 1885.